There can be only one map in each tier of this tier list. Today we are going to be doing a last spell maps tier list, and I decided that it would be a fun time to put together some interesting graphics to help enable that discussion. So to that end, we have a little info card in the center that reminds us how big the maps are, how many knights they are, what the boss is, and a few little special details. Then straight down from there, you have a beautiful, unobstructed, mistless view of all of the terrain in all of its isometric glory. And then off to the right, you have a hypothetically even more readable version of the map that is inspired by some of the work that I did on my Corpse Piles video. Link in the video description to that one if you want to check it out. Highly recommended. And if you're curious what the color coding means, lower left-hand corner is going to give you that. So, because this is a tier list of maps, I don't think I need to give my standard disclaimer, and I can just say that this is a tier list of how much I like the maps, and there are a whole variety of ways that I will be thinking about that. It's about the way the map plays, how each of the sides is designed, what the boss is like, what the nature of the wave composition is like, the theme, basically anything and everything that I can include in my calculations, I will. And ultimately what you are going to be left with is just a very qualitative evaluation of how much I like each of the maps. So, without further ado, let us begin where it all begins, which is by ignoring Swampfurt and diving straight into Gildenberg. Gildenberg is a 55 by 55 map. It is the home of the Harpies boss. It is 7 nights long, and things that are noteworthy about it from my perspective is that you are only fighting on 3 sides, and the mist really never gets that close. So, if we start talking about this map, the first thing that I will draw your attention to is the pink box that hopefully you can see right about here. That pink box is the nearest the mist will ever get to you. You'll see that on all of the maps, but I think it is useful and interesting to observe. Gildenberg in general, I'm not angry at Gildenberg. It is a little short for my taste. I think 7 nights is not quite long enough to get things really rolling or moving. I do like the kind of like minecartish theme. I think the way that the Harpies perch on the mountain is pretty cool. In terms of the design of the sides, I think I'm going to call it eastern side over here. It's really like southeastern side though, is really cool because of the way that it creates these kind of like narrow passages that kind of like really strongly funnel enemies into you. You can create some great bottlenecks. You can even use heroes to kind of like block on them, which I think is super fun. The northeastern face, which is up here, has some nasty line of sight stuff going on in the back here that can be a little frustrating. You'll often have like enemies dotting behind these rocks, and you won't be able to get all the shots off that you necessarily want to. And then over here on the southwestern side, you just have like some really nice funnel action going on that I don't mind. I think this corner in particular here is a lot of fun, just because of the way that you can kind of like stand behind this, it's called Chasm in the game files as a side note. And it's basically just any water tiles or void tiles that have nothing in them can be seen over, but you can't stand on them. So yeah, so there's something nice about being able to stand like either back here or in this area here and just have a nice unobstructed shot at the enemies without having to worry about them getting near you. So overall, I like Gildenberg. I think it's a good map that just doesn't really develop enough from my perspective. And I think as a result, I'm going to start it out in C tier. Controversially, because despite the fact that I like all of these maps. I think that Gildenberg just lacks that little bit of extra oomph. It's not quite long enough. You don't have enough time to get your characters to max level, which just generally feels a little bit of a bummer. That brings us to Lakeburg. So Lakeburg is the smallest map, interestingly, at 51 by 51 tiles. It has Nessie, aka Satusia, I believe, as its boss. It is 12 nights long, and it has a prominent lake in the north-ish area up here. You can also see it over here. It is massive. So Lakeburg is really interesting. First of all, I think 12 nights is absolutely the sweet spot for any map, including but not limited to Lakeburg. In terms of the various quadrants of it, I think this quadrant is perhaps the easiest one to defend of any quadrant in the entire game. I think the northeastern portion of Lakeburg just has so many good things going for it. You know, when the enemies are coming in here and you're taking advantage of all the different water features, you have a very narrow exposure, which means you basically know where the enemies are coming from. You have an indestructible box that you can stand behind here. You know, all of these things really, I think, play to the advantage of this map and make this quadrant, at least, really fun to play because you can play some non-standard builds. You could put an axe dude on this side and be very happy. Then on the southeast side over here, you have a relatively open side. I think the gates that you have here and here are just really, they're fun. They're nice flavor. The fact that you can repair them now, I think, is really cool. And then the combination of rocks and lampposts here are a little bit frustrating without being hugely problematic. They just mean that you have to have a little bit of mobility so that you can kind of move side to side across in order to get those enemies that are hidden behind. Also of note, the mist gets rather close, especially on the southeastern side. It'll come right into just behind these two lampposts on the front there, which is a mere 3 tiles away from your walls, which can be very exciting if you're going for more of a production wall build type of thing. As for the other two sides, I think that the northwestern side here, I love the chasms. Like this one, this one, this one, and this one are all just really cool because you can kind of stand behind them and play kind of like sniper with relative impunity. And generally speaking, this is a pretty open area that isn't too bad. You do end up fighting in this space a fair amount, which is a contrast to here where you basically never see enemies in this upper right-hand corner. Like the northeastern fighting area is really just like this space here, whereas like down here you have a bit of extra space over here that you're going to be fighting in. And then last but certainly not least, the southwestern one just has this kind of like diagonal old wall thing going through it that I think adds some good flavor. It hangs up early enemies. They spend a lot of time chewing on these walls, so I kind of dig it. I like it. But other things to talk about. I think that Nessie is, from my perspective, the quintessential boss of Lakeburg. As a fun and interesting thing, there is in the game files all of the locations that Nessie can spawn and all of the places where her appendage can spawn. So when I do eventually a boss guide on this map, I'll definitely include some of those interesting things. It's part of an XML file, and they're titled the flags for the base. But I think it's pretty interesting, and there's lots of good details in there that I look forward to sharing. But I think that fight is really good. I think the 3 phases are great. It means that the one shot isn't going to happen. Gives you some good flavor. She comes back a little bit stronger each time. So I really, really like the boss fight. I think 12 Nights is perfect, as I think I already mentioned that. And I think that generally, like the pacing of the waves, it's not the hardest map. Lakeburg is relatively easy, but it really is kind of like, from my perspective, the quintessential map in the last spell. And so if I'm thinking about a rating for it, Lakeburg, for me, it's just tops. It's the map that I have the most fun playing by far, just because I think you have enough time to get all of your production going or execute whatever strategy you want to execute without it being like insanely long. You have a really satisfying boss fight at the end. You have a cool map with some really interesting features. It has a lot of good things going on. So I really like Lakeburg. But that means that next on the agenda is Glenwald, the foresty map. It is 57 by 57. The boss is dryads, so many dryads, and it is a short 10-night fight. So special bits and bobs with Glenwald are the destructible line of sight objects. The wood piles are going to be blocking your vision until you destroy them, if you decide to destroy them. And then obviously the myriad dryads that are going to be checkering the map on the final night. So let's talk about the structure of Glenwald. The first thing I think to note is probably the forest, which I consider to be this area up here. Kind of extends over this way as well, but like it's mostly this space here. And the short version of it is that there is a lot of line of sight problems, especially with this upper corner, given that I think there can be a dryad that spawns here. Actually, I think it might spawn here. Anyways, doesn't really matter. It spawns somewhere up there. That is also in the game files. And then you also have this foreshortening of your base where this corner kind of gets cut off, which can create some kind of awkward situations. There's a lot of, I think, challenge in handling this. But the northeast quadrant, when waves are coming from this direction specifically, I really enjoy because I think that, again, especially if you start to let the fog come in a bit, you have these great funnel points here and here and here that heroes like axe heroes, etc., are going to really benefit from because there's going to be a huge density of enemies in those spaces. And then I think moving clockwise around, we then have what I consider to be one of the most like open areas. Like there's a lot of space over here to do things and not a lot of impediments. Obviously you have like these rocks here, and you have another set of rocks here. You have this like patch of trees here. So this side has its challenges, but generally speaking, it is a relatively straightforward side that can be held down pretty effectively. Then for the southwest side, I like this bit of flavor. Again, I hate that Glenwald's Haven is getting eaten into so much for these things, but I think it's interesting having these kind of like permanent walls. You have the statue here, you have a graveyard kind of scattered here. It's an interesting one, and I think it is a pretty straightforward side to handle, with the exception of the fact that you have this kind of like very foreshortened haven entry with these two kind of like bits jutting out. Glenwald is a very interesting shaped haven, I will say that. And then last but not least, if we're talking about Northwest, I think we have some nice water features here and here, which are interesting to kind of hide behind and kind of snipe from. And yeah. Overall, I think I like the step up in difficulty that Glenwald presents. Specifically, I like the fact that you start to get attacks from multiple different sides reasonably early on in Glenwald, and you feel very surrounded. It also introduces a new enemy, the Guardian, which is fun, and I think it's also potentially the first time that you can see Twisted. I don't think you can see Twisted on Lakeburg, but citation needed on that one. But overall, Glenwald struggles from a couple of things. First of all, the 10 nights is rough. That's a tough one for me. I don't love that we have any map that is as short as 10 nights for kind of like a bread and butter map. I often feel like just around the time I'm finishing that 10th night, I'm only just starting to get to the point of having all of my infrastructure built, etc. So I like maps that are a little longer, but Glenwald is fun. I think the Dryad fight is a bit frustrating. There's a lot of RNG that goes into it, right? You know, the difference between having a lot of ones that spawn here versus having a lot that spawn up here in this little no man's land can be really difficult. It does teach you good warp gate placement techniques and those types of things, but good versus bad Dryad spawning can be a huge difference maker in any given run. So how do I feel about Glenwald? I feel like it belongs in B tier, and I'm not sure why I didn't put Gildenberg here. So actually, I think I'm going to go with this. We're going to change things up a little bit. I think it's going to be Glenwald C tier, Gildenberg D tier, because we got some heavy hitters coming in that I think are going to need a place in the limelight potentially. Glenwald again suffers from short map syndrome. So let's talk about a map that is not short. Good old Elderlicht. Elderlicht is 61 by 61 tiles. Its boss is the archivist who sits on a throne of lies. It is 14 excruciatingly long nights, and it has the unique mechanic of soul vessels, and it has some truly monstrous and terrifying waves. So, where to even begin with Elderlicht? I love the style of Elderlicht. I think the underground nature with the columns and the soul vessels is really cool. I think the throne is super exciting. This is the throne here, or the throne here in the northeast corner. You have some very interesting chasms that I don't think I appreciate because I rarely am spending a lot of time way out here. One of the things that I've recently realized about Elderlicht that is made evident here, but kind of like caught me off guard, is if you look at the mist outline here, and I guess I'll draw all the way around it, but that's the mist outline. One thing that you find very quickly is letting the mist come in completely removes all of the braziers on this side, except for the corner ones here and the corner ones here. This looks like a face as a side note. But anyways, which is really interesting. And when you let the mist come all the way in, you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 potential spawning locations. And this is my first big complaint about Elderlicht. And that is that if you push back the mist, like let's say you have everything available, right? So your mist line is looking like this. You're kicking butt. You've pushed way back with the seer. There is a staggering amount of RNG. Like if you get this one and this one and this one and this one on a given night, plus some others mixed in, because 4 is never the number that you get, you can have an insanely hard time diving all the way in and then coming all the way back out to extinguish them. And obviously the AP cost is really expensive. So one of the things that I think they should fix about Elderlicht is I think the braziers should indicate where they are going to light during the deployment phase. I don't think they should wait until night 1 to show you that. That's a personal preference, but I think that it would make a big difference because you'd be able to plan your night and allocate your heroes a lot more effectively. But to talk about the sides just for a moment, I think that the northeast side is really interesting just because you get kind of like this pattern, which means that you have this kind of like safe zone in the middle here that you can place heroes and they're not going to be too much in danger. The braziers themselves are great to stand behind. They kind of function like chasms that you can kind of like put people behind, and they are relatively safe. They're not going to get at least full surrounded. But I think the northeast, very interesting side. I love the way that the throne plays with waves there. The eastern side the southeastern side and the northwestern side, this one here and this one here, I think of as like the narrow sides, right? Because you have your braziers here, you have your braziers here, here, and here. And you can at least have one hero like here and one hero here who can relatively effectively cover all of them. Something that is not the case over here in the southwest, where it is very hard if you place your hero here for them to make it all the way over here. So I like these sides. I think that the columns along the edge are very interesting. They add a little bit of flavor. You do end up in Elderlicht with a fair number of like X pattern attacks. You got something like this going on. So corners can be a problem, but overall I do like these two sides. I think they feel better. This side often feels a little bit off to me. The southwestern side, that is, just because I think that you almost always need to put like two heroes here in order to kind of like cover both sides, which makes you feel a little thin. Whereas over here, because you have the throne, I think you can get away with one servicing both. Also, the braziers are a little closer together. But yeah, I think it is, as I mentioned, it's a long map. I generally find that it takes me 10 hours to play Elderlicht, which I think is a little rough. It is certainly like it fills a spot as the epic map. I should also mention that it's very light on ruins. I think there are only 3 ruins or something like that. They give you some watchtowers. I think there are 4 ruins, but they give you some watchtowers that are not particularly effective. I generally like to tear them down. But I think there are a variety of strategies that work. My current playthrough that I'm doing right now is a corpse pile strategy, and learning that I could cut off so much of the RNG by letting the mist in has been transformational to the way that I think about Elderlicht. I think Elderlicht is better played with the mist close, which kind of surprised me, honestly, if I'm being honest. But anyway, so overall, Elderlicht is a tough one for me to rank. I think if I'm putting it in, it's really hard. It's really hard to decide between A and B tier. I think that despite my frustrations with it, it is a very good map, and I like that it conforms to the normal structure of a game. And we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, I like Elderlicht despite the fact that it is at times frustrating, but I think it is important that the game have a map that is truly punishingly difficult. And I think that Elderlicht is that map. That brings us to our final map, a bit of a foregone conclusion where it will end up. But Glintfein is a 63 by 63 tile map. It houses the twins, Schaden and Freude. It is 7 nights long, although I consider each of those nights to be kind of like a double night. It has random map features and boss fights throughout. On first glance, the empty Glintfein looks relatively empty. There's not a lot going on. There's a lot of what are referred to in the data files as dirt tiles, and not much else going on. But it is, as I mentioned, the home of the first randomness in map features that the last spell introduced. It is very complex to communicate that. If I were to, it would look something like this, where each one of these tiles has a variety of tags. Like this one was like parallel narrow, this one was parallel large, so on and so forth. But the short answer is that there are 15 different features that can get combined and recombined to make Glintfein what it is. But we won't be going through all of that. We're just going to stick with the basics. So because of that, it's very hard to talk about kind of the night structure. The short version is I love the fact with Glintfein that you have a production phase before the first night. I think that that's really interesting. I love that the Haven is completely empty, which means that you have kind of like a clean slate to do a really like idealized version of whatever you want to create. I like that there's a fair amount of stuff like crates, etc., just on the outside of the Haven rather than a lot of walls that you have to tear down inside of the Haven. I think that the 7 nights is a little limiting, and I also don't like that so many of them are boss fight nights. I think that the last spell plays really well as like a power fantasy where you're building up more and more hero capacity to decimate the horde, and then at the end you have some big challenge. With this particular map, you have a little bit less of that because you're kind of constantly battling the bosses. It's still interesting. It's still certainly a very fun map. I like a lot of facets of it. But I think that for me, the boss fights throughout make it feel more like a kind of like an end boss of the game without it being part of the game in the same way that some of the other maps are. And in some ways, I wish that there was a version of Glintfein that was just a very long map. I was doing some testing on stream and I just saw how many turns I could go before I got overwhelmed. And that was kind of a fun experiment. And it would be cool to see some random endless moment end up in Glintfein. But overall, there's not too much to talk about outside of the randomness of Glintfein. So I think with that, we put Glintfein in the B tier. And just to look at this for a moment, now that we have done all the things, we have Lakeburg in the S tier, which I totally agree with. It's my favorite map. I love playing it. Then we have Elderlicht in A tier, just because it's hard. It is a difficult map, and I think the game needs a difficult map. I think with some tweaking to the way that the soul vessels work, it could be fantastic. I think probably the toughest choice is Glintfein versus Glenwald. I could very easily see them swapping. I think that if I liked the Dryad fight a little more, I probably would. But I do think that Glintfein has kind of like an epic nature to it, and it does feel kind of long. So I do enjoy playing it, and I also like the clean slate nature of it. Then we have Glenwald, which I think is a great map, has some interesting dynamics, but just feels a little bit too short. And then Gildenberg, where you can't really even get off the ground. So that right there is my maps tier list. These resources that you've seen, the grids, the maps, etc., are going to be part of an upcoming series of guides that I'm going to do on each of the maps where I talk about the specifics. But I thought it would be fun to start out with a tier list and just talk about my favorites, which bosses I like the most, which maps I like the most, etc. So if this content is the kind of stuff that you like, please toss me a like and a subscription, because there is certainly always more coming. Feel free to swing by a live stream. Would love to have you. I am live Tuesday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., give or take, Pacific time. So the more the merrier. Feel free to swing by on whatever streaming service is your favorite. But with all that said and done, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'm going to get back to testing and honing my skills in the last spell and a variety of other games, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.